Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for a webinar on exploring access to environmental justice in Appalachia. We're very excited to have speakers from a variety of fantastic organizations from across the region with us today. But first, if you don't know the Ohio Environmental Council, we are a 50-plus-year-old advocacy organization dedicated to ensuring healthy air, water, and land for all who call Ohio home. I'm Trent Doherty, OEC General Counsel, and the director of OEC's Environmental Law Center. And as a part of what OEC does, it's also to ensure that we think deeply and critically about legal and policy questions and creating space for Ohio's legal community to participate in those discussions. This is our second continuing legal education seminar that we've offered for attorneys this year, and our fourth annual Ohio Public Interest Environmental Law Conference will be occurring next month, November 18th and 19th, virtually. So if you enjoyed today's discussion, we hope you'll join us for the law conference too. In that, we'll be focusing on our fight for clean, safe, and accessible water here in Ohio. But enough right now about the OEC, but we're here to talk about environmental justice in Appalachia. With us today are advocates from Appalachian Citizens Law Center, Fair Shake Environmental Legal Services, and Sustainable Ohio Public Energy Council. Some great partners, not just of OEC, not just of the environmental movement, but really of the region that really has experienced its history of environmental justice injustices. And I'm so excited that we're able to broach this, not just from the legal perspective, but not just to have an opportunity for lawyers to get CLEs, but also in attendance we have advocates, as well as hopefully law students and undergrad students who are going to be future advocates and be part of what I'm sure with the folks we have here today going to be a great future for environmental justice in Appalachia. So we have with us Wes Addington, the Executive Director of Appalachian Citizens Law Center, where he represents minors and the survivors of federal black lung benefits claims and whistleblowers in safety discrimination cases. We also have Mary Varson Cromer, who is the Deputy Director of ACLC, where she represents individuals and community groups in Eastern Kentucky and Southwest Virginia on a variety of environmental justice issues related to the legacy costs of coal mining, including landowners' rights issues, toxic waste disposal, and safe drinking water issues. Also, we have John Heer, staff attorney for Fair Shake Environmental Legal Services, a nonprofit environmental firm with offices in Akron and Pittsburgh. He focuses on petrochemical industry issues in the Ohio River Valley and dealing with property rights issues of coal mining, drainage patterns, and safe drinking water as well. And Luke Sulfridge, the Executive Director of the Sustainable Ohio Public Energy Council, a council of governments across Southeast Ohio and beyond, representing 21 member local governments focused on pursuing a renewed and sustainable energy economy. SOPEC member communities actually were the first community choice aggregator in the nation to adopt 100% Green E certified default power supply. So it's great to have these folks with us. A couple more logistics things. Today we'll be hearing from each speaker regarding the work that they do in pursuit of environmental justice in the Appalachian region, identifying the legal resources they have to advance the goal. In addition, we'll have a discussion about what resources they feel may be lacking as people who work with Appalachian communities on a daily basis. Following their presentations, we'll collaboratively discuss the barriers, opportunities, and the legal needs of Appalachia to achieve environmental justice, with a careful eye toward recognizing the parties not at the table or even in the audience. There will also be time for some Q&A at the end, so feel free to put your questions in the Q&A Zoom function so that we can consider those at the end. And if we don't get to all of the questions within our allotted time, I'm sure our our speakers will look to answer some of those questions offline. Also, if you are here for CLE credit, we wanted to make sure that you were all aware that the Ohio Supreme Court is just a few weeks behind in approving CLE applications, but we spoke with them yesterday, and they should have our application approved sometime next week. So don't fear, you'll have your CLE opportunity, but we'll be able to upload all of your CLE, all of your numbers in then when we get that approval. If for some reason this webinar were not approved, we wouldn't issue any refunds, but we're pretty confident we'll be all right. To comport with the Supreme Court CLE requirements, however, throughout the webinar, we'll have a few poll questions to verify your attendance and you're paying attention and you're watching it. If you've ever had a webinar CLE, you know what we're talking about. And we encourage CLE participants and actually all other participants to participate in those poll questions. In fact, let's go ahead and launch the first poll question. Chris, if you want to go ahead and do that. There you go. Excellent. Looks like, give another few moments. Great, looks like we're there. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everybody. So without further ado, I will turn it now over to John with Fairshake Environmental Legal Services.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the introduction, and I'm really glad to be able to participate in this this event. Really, I think it's such a necessary part of this problem that we face, which is really a sort of an underrepresentation of the need for legal services in this area. And so I'm very, very happy that very recently I started with Fairshake, and that's really the sum and total of my job with Fairshake. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. My name is John here, and I've been an attorney in Ohio for a very long time. I'll leave the details out there, but I've been around for a while, and I started out in practice in big law firms. I bounced around at a couple of different private law firms. I worked for as an in-house counsel for a large manufacturing company out of Northeast Ohio for a while, about 5 years or so. And so I've seen big firms, I've seen some small firms, I've seen what it's like to be in-house counsel. And about a year and a half ago, a little more than that maybe, I answered an ad for a job with Fairshake. And Fairshake Environmental Legal Services is a small nonprofit organization that provides legal services for, and it's specifically environmental legal services, for people who generally don't have the resources that many of my former clients might have had. We're talking about normally families, groups of property owners, nonprofit organizations. Those are kind of the bulk of our client base. And we try to price our legal services so that people can avail themselves of those legal services, no matter where they come from, no matter what their economic resources might be. Too often when I was in private practice, I would have to tell friends and colleagues and acquaintances that I was not able to help them simply because my legal services were expensive. And it is wonderful now that I work in an organization where a lot of what we do for folks can be priced in a range that is affordable. And we use a sliding scale that's based on either the organization's revenues or based upon the income of the individual clients. And we try to have a sliding scale that's reasonable, and it's based off of the poverty line. So when I started with Fairshake, we had offices in Akron and Pittsburgh. And so that's why I was introduced in that way, or the firm was announced in that way. Since that time, and since, of course, the pandemic, we have gone entirely remote, and we are probably going to stay remote for the foreseeable future. So it's not quite fair to say that we have offices in Akron and Pittsburgh anymore. We have a bulk of our attorneys in the Northeast Ohio area and in the Pittsburgh areas. We also have 2 attorneys in the Philadelphia area of Pennsylvania. So we do stretch our services beyond just Northeast Ohio and Southwest Pennsylvania. When I was hired, I specifically answered the ad that was geared specifically for Appalachia. And it was a grant that has thankfully been renewed, and we hope to keep renewing it every year to pay for my services. But it's specifically to address petrochemical issues in the Appalachian region. And it's not really defined necessarily by the grantors, but it really does involve everything from, I would say, Pittsburgh all the way down the Ohio River, even including Illinois, if it got to that. But we do have some work in Kentucky, West Virginia, Ohio, and Pennsylvania for the time being. And so I address most of my services for communities and individuals who are along the river, Ohio River, for the most part. In those services that we provide, we address whatever environmental legal issues arise. What we find, it does depend sort of on the area, and it does depend on the timing of things, because I think the legal field oftentimes follows trends as opposed to setting trends for legal issues. But we do everything from oil and gas to nuisance actions, to air pollution problems, to property issues. So the world of environmental legal services encompasses a lot, at least from my perspective. We don't just restrict ourselves to, say, contaminated property, for instance. We deal with whatever the client's got going on in their lives. Lately, I have seen an awful lot of work in where property owners are experiencing property damage as a result of water. And the change, climate change has a lot of different effects, and one of them is the amount of water that we're seeing. And as a result, we see a lot of property owners who are suffering damage to their property from the water patterns that are either changing or increasing as a result of climate change or whatever. So a fair amount of the litigation matters that I've been involved in recently have involved property disputes about who really is responsible for the damage caused by water. That can be, just the water itself or what's in the water. So again, the world of environmental legal services is broad. I guess I can tell you that we do represent everything from individuals to families to groups of property owners. I represent a number of about 24 property owners in a group around a compressor station for the oil and gas industry, and the problems that are arising out of that compressor station, both in terms of the emissions, air emissions, as well as the pipeline issues that are resulting from that. I represent municipalities who have asked us to prepare resolutions or look at legislation or regulation that they might be able to impose and use and enact in their location. Thankfully, our founder, Emily Collins, who founded the organization back in 2013, takes a very broad view of what we're allowed to do and what we should do as a legal community. And one of the things that might sound limiting at first, but I think it's actually freeing in a different way, and that is we have a very client-oriented perspective. We do not take on legal issues just as a legal issue. We don't have a priority list. We don't have an agenda, as some of the larger environmental organizations might. We take our clients as they come. So whatever that client needs is what we will address. And so we are a little bit different in that regard. We don't have the agenda that you might see in some of the larger organizations. We base our work on what the client needs. And that makes us a little bit different. So I've kind of wandered a little bit around, but if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer. And I don't know who's next up, so I will turn it back to Trent if you're still listening, Trent.
Yeah, thanks, John. And I'll tell on myself. I kind of went out of order, but you can tell how great the attorneys and advocates we have on today. They were unfazed that I jumped out of order. But we will go next. We'll go with Mary. If you want to hop on next to talk about Appalachian Citizens Law Center.
I am going to try to share my screen, and it looks like Zoom has changed its protocol a little bit for that. Am I going to be able to share my screen? Apologies, I was hoping. It's just.
Yeah, you have the green button down there at the bottom. It's the share screen.
Figure out how to share my second screen. There we go. How does that look?
Great.
Great, thank you. Well, hey, yeah, I am Mary Cromer. I'm Deputy Director of Appalachian Citizens Law Center. We're a small nonprofit in Eastern Kentucky. For many years, we are celebrating our 20th anniversary. For many years, we were very small. Very small being 3 to 4 staff members. And in the past 2 years, we have grown quite a bit in size, and we are now up to 10 full-time staff members. So we're much bigger than we used to be. And we provide free legal services for all of our clients. We have been very fortunate to be able to work on a model of providing free legal services because we've been fortunate to have some foundation support and some individual donor support. Although we would obviously like more support for all of our work. I have been at ACLC since 2008. And in that time, I have been the one attorney who's been handling our environmental justice litigation. And so what I want to talk about here is really just that work. For this presentation, I've sort of divided that work. I thought it would be good to just tell you all a little bit about the types of environmental justice cases that we have handled over the years. And so I've divided it into 3 buckets. And the first 2 buckets are exclusively coal mine related. And that's just because that's the most significant environmental justice need in our region. And then the last bucket is our broader community lawyering work, for which there is a huge need and growing need, but very little financial support. The first bucket is our standard sort of representation of individuals and families dealing with issues related to mining. And these cases are usually brought under SMCRA, the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act, or its state program. All states with coal mining, well, not all, most states with coal mining have programs, delegated programs in the state. So these cases can be brought either at the state court level, at the state administrative court level, or within the federal Interior Board of Land Appeals, or at federal courts. One of the types of cases within SMCRA that we have brought over the years are property damage cases, and those are often the most straightforward ones. A few of those have been some of my easier cases, I would say, in that there is very clearly damage and it's very clearly related to mining, but the potential for recovery is so low that the private bar has just not been interested in it. And so we've been able to come in and bring those cases under the SMACRA program and get attorney's fees and costs reimbursed. The other cases that fall into this bucket are the right of entry cases. And those are much more complicated and involve issues of land rights. And basically, these are the cases where our clients own the land or own an interest in the land, and the state has permitted coal mining on that land over their objections. And we've sort of fought those permits through right of entry challenges. And those, I had one of those cases that lasted about 6 years and involved 5 different administrative level cases, 2 federal court cases, and it eventually got decided by the Sixth Circuit, not in our favor. So these are cases that can involve lots of time and capacity, and you won't necessarily win. Just taken on another right of entry case involving a situation where the state of Kentucky has permitting coal mining that impacts my client's property over my client's objection. And we'll see where it goes, but these are pretty time intensive cases. The second bucket is the representation of multiple client groups in permitting or enforcement challenges. And this is really, I sort of consider this sort of the mountaintop removal litigation. This was what I was spending a lot of time on between, I would say, the years 2008 and 2014. That was a time when there was a lot of money and capacity being put into organizing in Central Appalachia. And there was a lot of interest from big green groups for bringing these types of challenges to mountaintop removal operations and bringing enforcement actions against mountaintop removal operations. But over, starting in 2014, that really started to dwindle. I will say, I think our role was critical in these cases because we served as lead counsel in a number of the cases, local counsel and others, but in all instances, our role was to make sure that the local voices were being heard, that it wasn't the sort of national green groups that were dictating how the litigation was handled. And that became particularly important in a couple of matters where settlement was being discussed. So I think it was really important that ACLC was involved there. In more recent times, I'd say, like, I've never stopped sort of being involved in what's happening with mining in the area on a more programmatic scale. We've sort of kept a hand in that on the policy level, but more recently, so we've re-engaged again in litigation around bankruptcy, representing a number of groups in one of the coal bankruptcies that's happening, just to make sure that the bankruptcy judge understands SMACRA, understands the company's reclamation obligations, and hopefully ensures that that there is money and an ongoing obligation to make sure that the land is reclaimed, even though the company is dissolving through bankruptcy. So that the work continues, but I would say overall, this piece of it, where we're working in coalition with a number of local groups and then big greens, I think that work is sort of evolving more into policy work as the coal industry really dwindles in our region. And then the third bucket is the community lawyering piece of it. And this is, ideally in community lawyering situations, you're the collaborator. You're working with community organizations that have capacity, that are working on a number of different fronts. It's not attorney driven. You're just, one piece, one collaborator in the mix. And, whether or not that's working as it should be, whether or not that ideal is being met, it requires that the attorney be integral to the organized community. It requires a lot of one-on-one time in the community. The two cases that we have been involved in that fall within this are a case in Estill County, and I say case, it's really not case, it's representation of a group in Estill County regarding radioactive fracking waste disposal in the county. And then the second is in Martin County, Kentucky, regarding the sort of failure of the public water system in that area. In both of those cases, when we were brought into the community was already starting to organize. And we helped that process just by helping them form the legal organization so that they had the capacity to sue, and then by facilitating those organizational meetings and listening sessions, just to make sure that we were getting a clear understanding of what the community needs and what the community's goals were. And a lot of that work, I mean, it's not litigation focused. A lot of the important strategy, like the important pieces of strategy, are around getting decision makers to do the right thing outside of litigation. So it's often about petitioning different decision makers, getting in front of agencies, not necessarily, and often it's not judges. So it's really important, I think, for people to understand that this is work that lawyers do that is not litigation, that is very, very important to ensuring that these communities' needs are met. And you can't come into it with the idea that the litigation is going to be the silver bullet that fixes everything, because in these very complex situations, that's almost never the case. And I guess the other understanding that I think people need to come away with is that community lawyering, as I said, it's not litigation focused. It also requires like almost daily kind of attention to making sure that, or to helping the community maintain the organizational capacity, that these organizing in these communities, especially environmental justice communities where you have vulnerable populations, it doesn't just happen organically, and it isn't maintained organically. There has to be some kind of impetus to make sure that it continues. And I'm not suggesting that, you as the lawyer, that is your job to do that, but that's a part of it, is just maintaining that sort of continuity, helping the community maintain that continuity, helping the community just continue the momentum, because these are long fights. They're not things that are easily solved. And just a reality check on this is that it's really important, I think, to understand that there's really very little funding for this kind of work. I've been very fortunate to be able to do it. Often, as I said again and again, it's not litigation focused. For the pieces that include litigation, there's often no hope of recovery of attorney's fees. And so I think that's why a lot of times this work is done by community lawyering clinics that are housed within law schools and not done by public interest attorneys. And then I would say what's next for ACLC and our environmental justice work is that even though there's a lot less active coal mining in Appalachia, that we will continue to be working on coal mining issues for the foreseeable future, primarily because there is a huge amount of what we refer to as functionally abandoned mine sites out there. Appalachian Voices did a study this summer showing there are about 633,000 acres of functionally abandoned mines in Appalachia, and that the cost of reclaiming those mines would be over $10 billion. At the same time, the Appalachian states with coal mining programs have less than $4 billion total in bond assurances to make sure that the land is reclaimed. So we think there's going to be a lot of work both on the policy and litigation front going forward to make sure that all those sites get cleaned up, or as many as possible. For community lawyering, I think there's no end to the need for that. I think as the coal industry continues to decline in Appalachia, the ugly truth is there are certain communities that are being left behind, and those communities need representation. And there's there's going to be a lot more need for that, I think, going forward. And I'll just say, we've really struggled to pay for this part of our work for about 20 years now. Philanthropists don't seem to want to fund environmental justice litigation. I'm not sure why, but we keep trying. And now we're really focusing on trying to raise some money for an environmental justice fellowship. The idea being that we would like to bring on a fellow for 2 years for a 2-year commitment, someone recently out of graduate school who can work with us and sort of learn the basics of what it means to be doing environmental justice work in Appalachia, with the idea that they'll take that knowledge and understanding to whatever job they go to next. And so if they go to a big green organization, they'll understand the importance of really engaging in communities and what it means to be doing this like very community-centered, client-centered work. So that's where we are now. We're hopeful that we'll be able to raise some money for that fellowship, and that we'll be able to bring someone on board to help out with this work in the near future. So thank you. I really look forward to our discussion and any questions and thoughts you all have.
Thank you so much, Mary. And just to point out the fellowship opportunity, that's something that OEC has tried also, because it's very difficult, especially on the advocacy and policy side, as well as on the legal side, for people to get started in this and have the opportunity to move the movement forward if they don't have a place to start. So I think that's fantastic, Mary. I hope all the success for that. We will actually pause for a second and launch our second poll question. There it is. Go ahead and answer that. Looks good. Great, everybody. We will then move on to next on our agenda, Luke with SOPEC. You're up. Thank you, Luke.
Thanks, Trent. I'll preface this by I'm probably the only non-attorney on this panel, but I do consider myself an advocate, and also want to acknowledge the other groups that aren't present. There's a lot around the region that could also be up here speaking. My family has been in this region, the European side, since Daniel Boone. Literally came with Daniel Boone, and prior to that in some of the Carolinas. And unfortunately have a very strong legacy and connection to the fossil fuel industry from EJ. I've lost family to mine explosions, gas explosions, black lung, cancer from acid mine drainage. So I wish that experience was unusual, but a lot of us who've lived here for multiple generations could very easily share the same, unfortunately. And we can't drink my tap water and can't trust the air, and live about a mile from an injection well, which I'll talk about in a second as well. The organization I represent today is the Sustainable Ohio Public Energy Council. We are a council of governments that has joined together to procure energy, but also work on energy policy. So we have found a lot of local governments don't have the expertise or capabilities to do this work on their own. So we are doing it collectively. So we bring resources in. A lot of times it is attorneys. We have law firms in Cleveland, Columbus, Dayton, all doing work for us on various issues. And it's our hope to push the ball forward. So on the EGA issues, a lot of times we are intersecting them. It's very much in the background what we're doing, very much motivating what we're doing, but we are trying to create positive change in the region, specifically in Appalachian, Ohio, helping procure energy, design programming, build out the region to where we control our legacy and our destiny as it relates to energy policy. So this is very grassroots, but also very driven in a bipartisan manner, which I think is a lot of fun this day and age, and a real testament to folks' willingness to work proactively on solutions when given the opportunity locally. All right, let's over here. So here's a map of SOPEC. Everybody seeing this now, or make sure you have the right screen share? Yes, okay, great. So we currently represent majority of communities in Southeast Ohio, but we represent communities across 33 counties, including most recently the city of Dayton. We're very excited they've joined us. I like to refer to a lot of our communities places of grit. So a lot of places that have done a lot with very little, and that usually intersects, unfortunately, with a lot of the environmental justice issues as well. So we do have a legacy of energy, but I think our future is also very bright as we're also leading in a lot of issues. The EPA Clean Power Partnership, we have 16 communities participating in Ohio, 14 are our member communities. As Trent mentioned earlier, we were the first in the country to adopt 100% Green certified default power standard. So in Ohio, you can shop where your power comes from. You can also do it at the community level as a block. It's a pretty neat program that was put in legislation when Ohio deregulated its energy markets at the turn of the last century. And we've leveraged that as a mechanism to really advance deployment of renewables and to explore even grander projects of building out our own here shortly. I also want to take advantage today to speak in the broader context of this conversation, introduce the gap that exists in Appalachian law schools. So this is, I'm going to talk specifically about Ohio, but it's a broader than Ohio problem. And this intersects with a lot of the previous speakers. If you look at this map, you'll note Ohio has 9 law schools, none of which are in Southeast Ohio. Southeast Ohio represents about a third of the state geographically, about a sixth of the state population-wise. Does have significant institutions of higher education, none of which house a law school. The surrounding states, West Virginia has 1 law school. It's all the way up in the northeast quadrant of the state. So a lot of folks in the southern part of the state don't have access either. If they want to pursue that. And I would say the same for Eastern Kentucky. They'd have to go to UK or Grundy or in Virginia to have access to law school, or even south to Knoxville. So there really is a real void. And I know it's a time when the profession is shrinking, but we know within this region that there's a strong connection between environmental justice, representation, and the ability of folks to pursue that are local to the region, and not to leave a profession to go pursue law school or be able to attend something like a night school, which simply isn't an option if the school is 2 hours or more away. The other connection to the law school gap here is, as Mary mentioned, the law clinics. Those are a very important component to having that resource and accessibility. So the fact we don't have any law clinics in the region, largely central Appalachia as a whole, not just southern Ohio, is also very problematic. So those resources are even more finite and makes the work that the folks on the call are doing that much more important. So we face the brunt of a lot of environmental justice issues as well. Here in Ohio specifically, one issue in particular, injection wells. This is one that is near dear to my heart. So living pretty close to one. All of our river counties in this map is actually more diluted than it would even seem, because the highest counties by tonnage are the border counties. Quite simply, the Estill County example Mary just mentioned a few minutes ago of them being able to criminally charge illegal dumping in Estill County, Kentucky. That's legal in Ohio. So that happens every day in Ohio of these same products being placed here underground, and many times communities that already have questionable water sources. So that is something layered, environmental justice layered on top of environmental justice. Number 1 in the county historically has been Athens or Washington County, or in the state. Northeast Ohio could give it a strong run for its money too, and those border counties, Columbia in particular, of the injection well coming from Pennsylvania and West Virginia. Ohio largely deregulated the industry for waste disposal in the early 1980s, and we're still suffering the effects of that. And the permitting process is, I'll say, very limited in community input as they go through those. It roughly takes about 2 weeks to get one of these approved. So very little room for the local community to organize or have significant input in those. So that's peripheral to what we do as an organization, but I think important to this discussion today that injection wells is a very real problem in Ohio in particular. Let's stop my screen share for a second and go to a few other points. Out of the screen share, sometimes it's equally difficult getting into it. I'm not succeeding at that. One of the other panelists wants to, I guess you guys can't do that. Hang on here. Oh, thank you. There, popped up. Thank you, Al. All right. Yeah, I think that's the majority. You have some of the largest cases in the country from an environmental justice standpoint happened right in this region. So the largest EPA fine history at the time was against DuPont for what was known as C8 at the time. now is more commonly known as PFAS by many of us. That happened right here on the Ohio line. It's also a problem from a regulatory standpoint. A lot of our regulators are very far from these communities that are affected. So these are all compounding impacts. If we don't have regulators on the ground, we don't have legal experts on the ground to work with us, we're very reliant on folks coming from 2 or 3 hours away. So again, shout out to the folks who are doing the work. We have a lot of really great volunteer advocates, a lot of really great resources that do come, but it is a continuous challenge for folks to be able to connect the resources they need in real time or quickly. It's also a strain on those folks who are trying to do this work without the funding that's available. And also for young folks considering law as a career, for them to make a decision about entering a career that is largely underfunded. And if they're going to pursue law school, considering the debt that they're going to be taking on and what choices they're going to have as an attorney and what kind of law they're going to pursue, especially if they come from a family of limited means in the first place and aren't a second or third generation attorney. These are all very real issues, and we definitely see those play out from a variety of whether it's coal, gas, water rights, again, compounding impacts. And I guess I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Luke. And I really appreciate that the non-lawyer was the one who brought up the lack of law schools and law clinics in that area. You know, a lot of the law clinics around, especially environmental law clinics, are backed by large institutions with the money and resources that can sustain a program when folks come in and out. So that itself is big. But also, as an attorney who went to school in Columbus and stayed in Columbus, I think that's what a lot of folks do, is they stay where they are in law school, where they've been able to create a practice, and that makes it even more difficult in Appalachia when you have that dearth of legal education. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. Before we get into like the more of the discussion, our last presenter, final speaker for the day, we'll be hearing from Wes Addington with ACLC. Wes, you're all set.
Thanks so much, and thanks for inviting me to speak. I've been with ACLC now for 17 years, and part of what's unique, I think, about our organization is not only do we try to address a lot of the environmental harms caused by extractive industries in Appalachia in our legal work, we also try to represent workers in those industries. And so, you know, the office is a little unique in that we're doing kind of both sides of that. And so, but a lot of the, you know, and part of the reason why is a lot of the families in our area that's impacted by a lot of the environmental harms that Mary works on also work in the industry. And unfortunately, sort of the harms that they experience are compounded because, especially as I'm going to show over the past couple of decades, you know, workers in specifically coal mining have been overexposed to dust and develop black lung, which can be disabling and oftentimes fatal. And so we've been doing, along with our environmental work, we've been doing federal black lung benefits cases for the 20 years of our existence. And I'll go ahead and share my screen. I think everyone can see that. So I thought I'd just start out. The reason I wanted to talk about this is not only you know, just to provide information about the issue, but also as a pitch to maybe some Ohio attorneys that may have some interest in this area of work. But as a background, coworkers pneumoconiosis or black lung, specifically in Appalachia, is the worst forms of it is worse than it's ever been in the United States. It's kind of hard to believe, but that's sort of the reality. And as an example, you can see what a healthy lung looks like there. miners that develop black lung or the simple form of the disease, their lungs often look like this lung. When I first came to ACLC in 2004 and started working on these cases, the vast majority of our clients that had black lung would develop this level of disease. However, over the past 8 or 9 years, a significant portion of our clients have developed what's called complicated black lung disease. And I apologize for the kind of disturbing photo, but that's the reality of what a lot of these miners are trying to live with. And, you know, that's kind of reflected by the data. So we didn't really regulate the amount of dust that coal miners breathe in this country until the early 1970s. But over time, over the decades ending the 20th century, we had just about eradicated the worst form of the disease. So that photo that I just showed, very small percentages of miners in Appalachia were developing disease that severe. However, over the past 20 years, this is what's happened. So at the time that they first measured coal miners, when they first started regulating dust in the United States, a little over 3% of miners in Appalachia had complicated pneumoconiosis. So I mean, it was the Wild West at that point. Operators could subject them to as much dust as they want, and what that resulted in is a little over 3% of miners develop very severe disease. Since then, and this is during a period of constant regulation and dust limitations, now more than 5% of miners in Appalachia have the very worst form of the disease. So it really is an epidemic. And our clients are dying at much younger ages. We've had clients in our office, die from black lung in their 40s, in their 50s. And, like I said, when I first started doing these cases, most of my clients were elderly because they, had taken a long time to build up enough dust burden on their lungs to develop the disease and then, resulting disability because of it. So what I thought I'd talk about a little bit with federal black lung benefits is just sort of what a miner has to prove. So they're available to any coal miner that's totally disabled due to pneumoconiosis or black lung. And then also to survivors of those miners. And that, typically is either a spouse or an adult disabled child, for example. And what it does is it provides not only compensation to those miners, although it's very meager, and I'll get to that, but also medical coverage for the treatment of the disease. And although the medical term for coworkers pneumoconiosis is fairly limited, the legal definition includes kind of what you see on your screen there, which is essentially a host of different types of disease that's caused by the inhalation of dust, at work. And so the law allows, for compensation for development of any of these types of diseases due to the mining employment. Unfortunately, as you can see, the benefits are quite meager. So, if you're a coal miner that's, 50 years old, that developed a totally disabling lung disease due to just going to work every day, you're entitled to $693 a month. Most states have a workers' compensation program that, you can potentially also receive some money from, but due to sort of the terrible nature of black lung disease, it's often latent and then progressive. So it may not show up for years after you leave mining, but then progress over time to completely debilitate the person. And, a lot of those workers' comp statutes and sort of systems, over time, you may be barred from filing those claims, even after you develop the disease. So your only remedy might be just federal black lung benefits. And for a lot of our clients, that's the reality. And so, it's a very small amount of money. Obviously, it jumps up to $1,000 a month if you have a dependent, a spouse, or a child, a minor child living at home, or a disabled child. And I thought I would also mention, the amount of claims kind of in Appalachia, and what that means for the region. Although the benefits are really too low and very meager, for a lot of these states, especially the coal mining regions of the states, it's quite a lot of money that goes in each year. So in Kentucky, we're talking $40 million. Ohio, other than the larger coal mining states of West Virginia, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Kentucky, Ohio receives the fifth most amount of money for black lung, and has the most current claims and payment of any other state in the country. Now, part of the issue with that is, can minors and their survivors access representation? And that continues. It's always been a problem, and it continues to be a problem. And I'll show you some stats in just a second. So just kind of a really brief primer on how the system works is sort of the first step is you file a claim with a district office. And so there's a district office in Columbus, Ohio, and it handles claims for, any minors in Ohio, living in Ohio, or any minors in sort of southern Indiana, southern Illinois area. And then after you file the claim, the minor is entitled to a free pulmonary examination. I mean, it's a complete exam. It's the type of exam that, if done properly, will show whether the minor's totally disabled due to black lung, and can, when on its own, can be enough to prevail in a federal black lung benefits claim. And so the Department of Labor provides the minor with a list of physicians that are on their list who can perform that examination. And the way the system works, it's a little quirky, is that the minor is allowed to choose anyone off the list in their state or any state that touches their state. So, for example, Ohio minors, can go to Kentucky or West Virginia if they choose to see a doctor that's on that list. So the way the claim progresses is, it's for the most part an administrative system, kind of housed within the Department of Labor. And that district office, as you go, over to medical evaluation, down to this SSAE and PD&O. PD&O is just, another way of saying a decision in the claim. And that's sort of an initial decision in that district office. And then any requests for hearings, if there's a disagreement about that decision, goes to an administrative law judge. And then there's another body above that that reviews the ALJ decisions, called the Benefits Review Board. Any further than that can go into the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Court of Appeals that the state proceeds to, but that's fairly rare. I mean, for example, I've had a couple of those appeals in 17 years, and only one that actually went to a decision. So for the most part, the system is completely administrative. Now the problem is, as you can see here, I've highlighted the amount of claimants that are represented by attorneys in these cases. And although it's, it's crept up over the last 4 or 5 years, still over half of minors or survivors do not have attorney representation in the cases. So they're either pro se, or they're being represented by something in the system called a lay representative. And that's typically in federally funded black lung clinics. And there's actually one of those in Ohio, in Zanesville, Genesis. And they do provide, sort of trained lay employees to help minors or survivors sort of wade through the claim. But I can tell you that there's really no substitute for a claimant to have an attorney, because the insurance company or the coal company, depending on who's on the hook for benefits, are going to have, experienced attorneys trying to beat these claimants out of their benefit. And they're successful, quite often, especially when the minor is pro se. So, I guess my pitch then is there are very few, if any, attorneys in Ohio that take these cases on for Ohio minors. You can do these cases in any state. Our office has handled cases all over the country, but just as from a capacity standpoint, we're really limited in the number of Ohio claimants that we can take on. Not only from a distance perspective, but now with COVID, a lot of these hearings are being done either over video conference or over teleconference. And so the client, even with that distance factor, you're not getting an in-person hearing with your client. And so we've been somewhat reluctant to try to, take more of those cases on than we currently have. And it'd be great if more attorneys would be interested in doing this work. So for example, one of the very few attorneys in sort of the Western Kentucky coal fields that handle cases there and in Southern Indiana and Southern Illinois recently died from COVID. And he had a pretty significant practice. So there's going to be a real need for attorneys to do this work. The positive side of this is, and I'll end on this, is, the Affordable Care Act restored a presumption that was taken away during the Reagan administration, where now any underground miner or surface miner that has regular dust exposure and of 15 years, so they have 15 years of employment and a totally disabling pulmonary impairment, the law assumes, at least in part, what's causing it was all that coal dust exposure. So then the company or the insurance company has to rebut that presumption. It's pretty difficult to do. So if you get the benefit of that legal presumption, you have a really good shot of prevailing for your client. And it's a fee shifting statute. You can charge an hourly rate. Typically those hourly rates that I'm aware of in Appalachia are somewhere between $200 and $300 an hour for attorneys that do this work. I'm not saying you can sustain an entire practice doing it, but if you wanted to do some of this work and help some people out, there's a decent chance if you take on cases that have a shot of winning that you can be compensated for your time. And so I think I'll end there, and happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Wes. And that just brings to mind what, as also an environmental lawyer for the past 16 years, one of the things that I make sure I tell, especially lawyers out there that aren't environmental lawyers, is that if you work to protect workers' rights, you're actually an environmental lawyer. If you work to protect communities, you're actually an environmental lawyer. If you're there to really protect anyone, no matter if you think it's environmental law or not, it is. It really is. And I think it's the same thing with the kinds of cases and issues you talk about. Is that there are those attorneys out there that can and have the ability and have the passion for it in their current practice, and just bringing that into this and interweaving. The corporate defense side of the bar it has the capability to make everything a silo, and this is health law, this is natural resource extraction law, this is environmental law, this is personal injury law, and keep it separated. On the plaintiff side, we can't do that. We have to bring these issues together, and it's this discussion so far has been great to sort of symbolize that. And I think, one of the things, before we get into a little bit of discussion, just to point out that before I ask a question about what are the gaps in Appalachia, and Luke, you brought this up also, and I think one of our participants on the call, Kathleen's brought it up, like there are other organizations out there especially the community development organizations. The biggest one, obviously, is Rural Action. There are smaller, ones focused on community development, and obviously community development organizations in Appalachia do a lot more than just what you think about community development. And so, if we had 3 or 4 hours, we would have Rural Action, a lot of those community development, a lot of those other organizations, big and small, on here. But definitely participants look into those as well when you want to just learn more about really what is at stake, and actually what's happening, and really what the positive future of the region is. We can see. But let me start the discussion just with the question I kind of alluded to, which is, we presented on all this incredible work. You've all sort of touched on this issue of where the gaps are, but just to hit that point a little bit more, in your experience, what gaps do you see when it comes to getting a really achievement towards these environmental justice goals in the region, and what community needs perhaps aren't being met or could be met more? And I think anybody wants to pop up with just a discussion on that.
Well, I'll start. To me, I think one of the biggest gaps is sort of sustained support for communities that are trying to organize. In so many situations, we see sort of grassroots organizing happening on Facebook, but there's very little support beyond that. And it often doesn't move beyond that because there's very little support for that. And I mean, both like financial support and, people who can come in and sort of, or train people in the community about how to maintain community organizations. And so to me, that is one of the big pieces that seems to be missing.
Mary, this is John. Let me just ask you to clarify that. Do you mean like when I see, this happens a lot with my client base, where the group, whoever's affected, will make a group of some sort on Facebook? And are you saying it kind of peters out after that there's a formation of the group, that they get together, they might get on Facebook and make a cause known that they might be facing, but there's no push to achieve a goal or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, and they may have goals and things that they want to achieve, but it seems like at some point there needs to be some kind of money, some kind of foundation support that is put into communities like that is available for those organizers to further their work. And so I have seen a number of cases where there's a lot of energy around an issue on Facebook, but it seems like there's no financial support, there's no capacity support behind that. And so the people who are driving that just get exhausted after a while and drop out, and then it sort of fizzles.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm aware of 1 or 2 organizations in the region that have small funds that they can make available to community groups. I'm talking about $1,000 or $1,500, something like that, to help start some type of an organization. But there's not a it's not a constant source, and it's not something that could sustain a long-term 5-year plan to address a wrong. It's more a put out a fire type of resource, very temporary. And we similarly, we have a lot of foundations that support our group and what we do, but it's difficult to get the resources to the people who need it the most. Unless they are somehow put in touch with one of us, that actually has some kind of a connection to the community. A lot of people just don't know where to look for help. And so there's just a lot of people struggling and facing, real hardships that just don't know where to turn.
I think it'd also be prudent to mention, with the absence of law clinics in the region, we've seen a lot of academics take some personal risks in pushing the research to being allies and advocates. So I don't know if that's a particularly unique role, but it's definitely one we've seen them step up in the region to the ability they can. And sometimes it may be University of Cincinnati driving 4 hours across the state to help a community in Eastern Ohio. So it may not always be that community that's right next door, but I think they're an important part of this conversation as well.
Yeah, and to follow up on that, in addition to, sort of the map that you showed about lack of law schools in the region, not only clinics, but just, promotion of careers in public interest. I mean, I can tell you, although I think a lot of people think that people go to law school like laser focused on, what the end result of that experience is going to be and what the career is going to look like. I mean, I went to law school with quite a few people that, landed in law school, and I was one of them. And then you're trying to figure out, what your life's going to be. And the way I ended up in public interest is I was flipping through like a career services packet. I mean, a huge packet. And there was an opportunity at the University of Wisconsin, of all places, to do a land use fellowship for the summer. And one of the sites was ACLC in Eastern Kentucky. And that was the way that I found my way into public interest work. And so it'd be great if there was more of a push, at least letting law students know that, you can come back to some of these communities that you care so much about and make careers, or at least do some of that work, even if it's not, a full-time career. I mean, and the result of all that is, you just have very few public interest lawyers in the region. I mean, Mary, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I was thinking about this as we were doing it, but I think you're the only Eastern Kentucky-based environmental attorney that does public interest work. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
For Eastern Kentucky.
I mean, that's the entire region, 500,000 people or so. So
I think everybody here has touched on this notion that I think public interest is just not promoted at all at the law school level. And just as evidence of that, I mean, I've been in practice for 30 years. And until last year, when I saw the ad for this job, I didn't know there was such a thing as a nonprofit law firm. I had no idea that existed as an entity and that it could do things like what we do. I've been in practice for 30 years. And I have a fairly good connection. I do adjunct teaching at Case Western Reserve, where I graduated. And, it's certainly not pushed there. It's not a alternative that is promoted there. And I'm not faulting that law school, but I just think that there's not much push from that level beyond, and therefore there's not an awareness publicly.
No, you're right, John and Wes and Mary, all of you, that the public interest environmental lawyers always end up with a weird origin story that never starts, and it usually doesn't start in I'm 10 years old and I want to be a public interest environmental lawyer. That's not how, I know some of my friends that are corporate defense attorneys, that's how they started, but whatever. Ours is just something, I created the law center at Ohio Environmental Council essentially as soon as I got an externship at OEC, and like, well, we need to have a program here, and why don't you pay me to do it? And it's sort of happy accidents like that are great. I mean, I wouldn't have traded that for the world. And it sounds like, Wes, you had a similar experience by just finding the place, but it's finding the place first. And it can happen, in some of these smaller organizations and even some of the larger organizations in the region, just getting lawyers and law students and young up and comers to check out and see what these communities need and want and have. And you can make a good career out of it. I know some of us sitting on this call are evidence of that. But let me sort of switch that, maybe turn that gap issue on its head a little bit and ask, and maybe I'll probably start with you, Luke. So from an outsider's perspective, outside of the the region, what do outsiders not know is happening there in Appalachia, especially Luke in Appalachian, Ohio, that's going to sort of change these dynamics, sort of change this legacy, and things that are looking upward in the region.
I'd say the region's resilient. Folks have been here since centuries, and before the Europeans settled, folks were here before that. This is a very vibrant region from an ecological standpoint. It's resilient despite the damage we've done to it. It breaks my heart every time I hear the number of acres have been strip mined, as we used to call it back in the day. But moving forward with climate change, there's a real opportunity for us as a region that's very water rich. To a fault, we're now dealing with flooding for a variety of reasons, some of which are connected to discussions today. But you have that natural resource wealth, whether it be the just ecosystem around those forests, trees, it's actually a livable place to live, aside from, and I sometimes get my hopes up if one major polluter puts in the proper controls, or but it's kind of whack-a-mole a lot of days where another one pops up right behind it and you're moving on to the next fight. But you also see clean energy economy emerging. So since we are at a position where we've had an energy leadership role historically, the narrative is shifting, and there's some embrace of that. And I think folks are proactively being more open to it. We have, my organization does a lot of community grants. We do a lot of very direct consulting with our communities and help fund some of the work through our program. So we're helping a local police force convert their electric or their cars to Teslas. That's happening here very shortly. We're having other communities that are putting solar on their fire department or police department. The number one county per capita in the state for solar is Athens County, which is also the poorest county in Ohio. So I think that is a real opportunity as we're looking at retooling, retraining, new opportunities. And I usually refer to it as a renewed energy economy, because this is a new economy for us. This is what we've always had in this region, but helping us steer it. And then part of the drive with SOPEC is us helping be a part of that conversation, the decision making. So we're very community driven, very democratically driven by our communities. So I think at a positive front, as we challenge the narrative of what remember some of the old Appalachian studies referring to us as the national sacrifice zone, there's a lot of truth to that, and we've been treated historically from a resource standpoint. And I've worked with a lot of local officials, getting them to envision a future that may be very different, but that we have to have clean, drinkable water for us to have sustained, and that may be the infrastructure behind it. Historically, the coal mines may have been the ones propping that up, where we're making some very real policy decisions now. And I think that that's a critical junction point for us as we become a climate refuge. And we also have a really vibrant agricultural community. Growing local is not something new. It's something that we're readopting on larger scales, but I have a lot of hope in the renewable energy economy. From the deployment standpoint, we have a lot of labor opportunities if we make sure that we leverage that and really build on it. But I think it's a narrative that doesn't have to split on party lines or partisan lines. Solar is number one job growth sector. Wind is number two. We don't have a lot of opportunities in some parts of Appalachia. Other parts of Appalachia, phenomenal opportunities for wind. Eastern West Virginia is putting up a ton of it right now. Some of the very same places that may have been strip mined historically. So our future is definitely in the food economy. It's definitely in the energy economy. And I think that we need to value our place as a whole and the people. Historically, I've seen literature going back to the 1940s, local chambers publishing literature of basically an amicable workforce and some really derogatory. I've heard politicians use those terms pretty recently of referring to the workforce as really easy to get along with. But I think we just did our own disservice that we have a very hardworking, like a lot of folks, but we take that as part of our identity in the region. I think we need to own that and transition to the next phase of that.
Great, thanks, Luke. If anyone else wants to chime in on that, so that question of what's there that is promising, especially those things that folks that are outside of the region might not know is there and happening. If anyone wants to chime in, and also folks, the participants, feel free to put in your questions in the Q&A section if you have any.
I would also extend to the broader legal community. Telecommuting is becoming more and more commonplace. It is a policy priority for local officials in every Appalachian state to build up the broadband to make sure that we can be connected to the degree we need to be. So I think there's some real opportunities for folks who may have been at a large firm historically in a city to think outside the box a little bit and look at quality of life. A lot of folks I know from Columbus found their refuge in a cabin they may have previously bought as a weekend cabin and decided they liked it a lot. So a lot of our communities are starting to plan like that too, as they try to attract talent and population back to our communities.
Actually, that brings up a good point, Luke, as far as broadband. One of the things that I did not comprehend, I just didn't get the whole picture until I started working in this area more, is the lack of internet access and broadband access that I had taken for granted for years now in my location. It's very difficult in many of the areas that we're talking about to get coverage, whether it's cell phone coverage or whether it's internet access, whatever that is. That whole information pipeline that I take for granted in many cases doesn't exist. It just can't exist because of the topography down there, especially in the West Virginia area and Southern Ohio. It's hard to get coverage down there. And so the difficulty of communication and lack of access as a result, that surprised me, the level of difficulty that, and especially because we were all of a sudden put into this pandemic world where that became so important, and that was really our only way to communicate. I know in Ohio there are a lot of regulations being reviewed and changed to try to address the lack of access. I mean, like, does it make sense to require publication in a newspaper anymore? I mean, does anybody actually read a newspaper anymore? So, I mean, it's something that we have to really come to grips with, and hopefully the broadband issue does get improved down in that area. But, until then, I think we have to acknowledge that it's not very easy for everyone to just hop on the internet. It just doesn't happen that way.
That's an excellent point, and just the problems with the way the slowness in terms of government changing their idea of what public notification needs to look like, and whether it actually notifies the public where they are, has been an issue that has irked me for a long time, and especially as we get this difference between certain parts, especially in Ohio, certain parts of the state can get information however they want to get information, but others cannot. And the governmental entities continue to presume everybody's getting it a certain way. And as you said, John, sometimes it's that way it was 30 years ago when that code was written and hasn't changed. And obviously that's one of the many issues that do need to change. And again, a lot of these are just a spark, again, more of the conversation you all have talked about, and really just to sort of pinpoint some of that. But really, it was this entire discussion was kind of the brainchild of one of our former team members at OEC, Carol Davey, who grew up in Cheshire, Ohio, and came up really with the discussion with the attorneys at OEC about the issue that you talked about, Luke, which is the lack of law schools in the Appalachian communities in Ohio or near there, is sort of what's triggered what the discussion has been. And that discussion, as we've had so far this past hour and 20 minutes or so, is much broader than just that. That's just one of the maybe infrastructure needs, to use that term, that's out there. But if you could just, in your view, just going to pepper that out to all of you, what sort of infrastructure is needed? Legal infrastructure, other types of infrastructure, again, in that broad definition we'll use for that term, to better really counteract the environmental injustices that you all have brought up here facing Appalachia? So what kind of those infrastructure is needed, and really who can bring that?
I could follow up real quick, Trent, and then I'll clear the floor. Carolina and I both attended Berea College. I don't think that's a coincidence, but as you know, Berea, it's students with limited means and high potential. Both of us have multiple master's degrees at this point. Neither one of us went to law school. Both of us grew up in environmental justice communities, and we're not alone that way either. I'm just singling out the two of us, but I think there's a very clear lack of a path for those of us who do know exactly what we want to do with our lives, and that is environmental justice through the legal community. There's not a clear path for folks living in these communities to achieve that, knowing that lawyers in their town do very different kind of work, or seeing folks who may have went to the state universities come back home and doing oil and gas title work. So I think that there's a lot of underrepresentation from folks who are very deep and ingrained in these communities, and not clear opportunities for them to pursue that career. And part of that is geographic. But I think there's a broader socioeconomic conversation to be had, and that's happening nationwide with law schools. But I think it's a very real, tangible example here within Southern Ohio.
And I'll just sort of add a different tack on the question, which is there are a lot of types of cases where there is a need for representation, and clearly that representation is most likely going to be representation of low-income individuals or disadvantaged groups, and there's no fee shifting statute. And like one of the things that I think in Kentucky, where it shows up most is representation of groups before the Public Service Commission. So that's the commission that regulates all utilities. And there's, a huge demand to have representation of low-income groups, especially when you're talking about electricity rates or water rates. But there's no possibility for fee recovery. And so there's very little likelihood. I mean, I have done that work. I've been fortunate enough to, be able to do that work at ACLC, but there's no, it doesn't make sense for any organization that's coming out with a strategy or a plan to go into that work, because how are they going to pay for it? So I think, there's a structural need to look at all of the statutes that are used and see where it makes the most sense to have those fee shifting provisions.
I think that's a great point, Mary. I was gonna approach it from a different perspective and say that one of the things that I have had difficulty with is having expert testimony available, access to experts, people who can support from a scientific perspective, support your claims, whether it be black lung, or if it's something environmental, geographic, geological, whatever the case may be, where you need a scientific background. If there's very little access to public interest legal resources, I think there's much less in terms of scientific resources. So if we're looking to shift fees, which I think is a great idea, that we should look into opportunities to incentivize lawyers, there ought to be some way to incentivize the scientific community as well to also participate in this type of work, because that can be the case killer right there. If you can't bring an expert to bear on your case, you just might as well go home.
Great. I think I've got my 1 minute warning before I have to start wrapping up, but there's one question from the Q&A I want to lift up from Jackson Savage. What role, I think it's very interesting, what role might artistic outreach programs have in the region's future for environmental community organization, as well as environmental community lawyering as well? I think that's an interesting an important piece, just all of the parts of the community that can be part of just getting the organization going. So that's definitely, if nothing else, just lifting that up as a question, and maybe it's online or offline. I know I'm getting the hook here to get into close it down. But as I'm pulling it up, if anybody has any ideas on that or want to touch base on that afterwards, feel free.
I'll just say I think that's really interesting, and I just want to mention that in our work in Martin County, some of the things that have been done to really elevate the issue. There's a filmmaker who has done a documentary on the issues in Martin County, and then there's been a local artist who has done some really great, very striking visual images that have really helped a lot, I think, in getting more eyes on what's going on. And so that's been really, really useful, and I'm happy to talk about that more.
Yeah, it's definitely the visuals that do bring in folks everywhere to really understand what's happening. Well, that's it for today. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you so much for the panelists taking time. Thank you so much. We encourage you all to learn more about their organizations and the work they're doing, as well as doing the research and finding all those other organizations that are out there in the region. For any students on the call, we hope you'll use this conversation to think about what path you might want to take in your future career. For current attorneys, as I said before, think about how your work can be used here and now, and how you can utilize your practice, whatever it is. We still think you're an environmental lawyer. As you can see, we've got the next and final poll question up. And as you're working on that, don't forget OEC's Public Interest Environmental Law Conference coming up next month, November 18th and 19th. Be on the lookout for an invitation for that. We hope to see you there. And finally, attorneys here for CLE credit, please ensure that you complete the survey that will appear when the Zoom ends. And as a reminder, we're still waiting on Supreme Court CLE office to approve our application, but we'll notify you all the moment the application goes through, and to make sure we've got your information to send off to the Supreme Court. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, panelists. This was fantastic and a well-needed topic to discuss. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day.